Nobody in the kingdom feared him anymore, and that was exactly what he wanted. For 3 years, King Caelan sat at the head of a great stone table, while other men made decisions around him. He nodded when they spoke. He paused longer than necessary before answering simple questions. He once forgot the name of a general he had known for 15 years. Or at least, he pretended to forget. The council members exchanged glances across the table. His half-brother Edric covered a small smile with his hand. And Caelan, King of Valdrek, lord of the most powerful military kingdom in the known world, and saw all of it and said nothing. It had started 2 years before the performance, with a cup of evening tea. The tea had not been meant for Caelan. It had been placed on the wrong tray by a servant who had since disappeared from the palace staff without explanation. The man who drank it, his personal taster, a quiet and loyal man named Doran, who had served the royal household for 22 years, was dead before the evening fire burned low. Caelan had watched from across the room, and in the hours that followed, something inside him had shifted. Not broken. Shifted, like a stone being placed deliberately in a new position. He spent his recovery in bed, pale and reportedly weakened by the shock of witnessing the poisoning. Servants brought soft food. Physicians came and went. Edric visited twice, each time wearing an expression of careful concern that did not quite reach his eyes. And in those quiet days, while the palace moved around him and assumed he was resting, Caelan was thinking harder than he had ever thought in his life. He had always known his half-brother wanted the throne. That was not a secret. It was barely even a secret that Edric tried to keep. What Caelan had not known, until the tea arrived on the wrong tray, was how far the plan had already reached. He had assumed it was personal ambition. He had not yet understood that it was a network. On the 5th day of his recovery, a woman came to his room under the cover of delivering a second physician's report. Her name was Seraphine Voss. Her late husband had served as Caelan's spy master, before dying in circumstances that the official record called an accident, and that Seraphine had spent 2 years quietly investigating. She placed the physician's report on the bedside table, said nothing for a moment, and then set a second piece of paper beneath it. The second paper contained 17 names. Caelan read them slowly. 3 were council lords, 2 were senior commanders in his own military. 1 was an ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of Orvienne, which was ruled by a clever and dangerous queen named Magistra, who had survived more political storms than most kings ever saw. And at the top of the list, written in Seraphine's precise and careful hand, was the name of his half-brother. If you move against them now, you catch fingers. I need to catch the whole hand. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, picked up the physician's report, and left the room. That was the beginning. What followed required a kind of discipline that Caelan had never been tested on before. He had fought in wars. He had made difficult decisions under pressure, in the field, with lives depending on his speed and his clarity. That kind of strength he understood. This was different. This required him to be slow where he was naturally fast, uncertain where he was naturally decisive, and quiet where every instinct told him to act. He began to play the role carefully. In council meetings, he spoke less. When he did speak, he sometimes lost his train of thought mid-sentence, and had to be gently redirected by Edric, who handled these moments with a smoothness that revealed just how long he had been practicing for them. Caelan allowed a trade agreement to pass, that he knew was designed to funnel royal funds toward Edric's private accounts. He let a senior military appointment go to a man loyal to his half-brother. He smiled pleasantly at Queen Magistra's ambassador, when the man spoke to him in the slow, exaggerated tone one uses for the very old, or the very simple. Every night, when the palace was quiet, he walked through a passage behind the old library and down a set of stairs that most of the palace had forgotten existed. At the bottom was a room that smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Seraphine was always already there. They worked by candlelight. They built a picture of the conspiracy piece by piece, the way a careful person assembles a mosaic, one small tile at a time, stepping back often to see how the larger shape was forming. Seraphine had people inside Edric's household, inside the council offices, and, most importantly, inside the court of Queen Magistra. The queen, it turned out, had agreed to provide financial support for Edric's rise in exchange for trade rights and the eventual absorption of 3 border territories. She believed Caelan was mentally declining. She believed the transition would be smooth. She had been told this by her own ambassador, who had been told this by Edric, who had constructed the story with great care. It was a good plan, Caelan could admit that. It was a genuinely good plan, and in a different version of events, it might have worked. But it had one weakness that its designers had not accounted for. They had built it around a version of Caelan that did not exist. The first year passed. Caelan endured things that cost him more than he showed. There was a morning when the general who had trained him, an old man named Severus, who had pulled a teenage Caelan through his first winter campaign, with steady hands and steady words, came to what should have been a routine military review, and directed his entire briefing to Edric instead. Not from disloyalty, simply from the reasonable conclusion, based on everything he had observed, that Edric was the man now making real decisions. Caelan sat at the table and drank his water, and smiled at the appropriate moments, and that night, alone in the archive room before Seraphine arrived, he sat very still for a long time. She found him like that, and did not pretend not to notice. "How much longer?" she asked. "Until they're all in the same room at the same time," he said. "Every single one of them. I need them comfortable enough to gather. Comfortable people stop being careful." She sat down across from him. "And when they gather, then we close the door." In the second year, Caelan began to make very quiet moves, not visible ones, nothing that could be observed by anyone watching the surface of the court. He repositioned a senior palace guard commander, whose loyalty he trusted completely, giving the man a new assignment that placed his unit in charge of the inner keep's access points. He found, through Seraphine's network, that one of the council conspirators, Lord Chancellor Brath, a careful man motivated entirely by self-interest rather than any genuine loyalty to Edric, had been promised the same financial reward by 3 different people within the conspiracy, none of whom knew about the others. Caelan arranged, through a chain of intermediaries so long that no one could trace it back to him, for Brath to discover this. Brath said nothing to Edric. He said nothing to anyone, but he began sleeping poorly, and he began to drink more at evening functions, and he began to look at Edric during council meetings, with an expression that was just slightly different from the expression of a man who is fully committed to a plan. Caelan noticed. He filed it away. The most difficult moment of the entire 3 years came near the end of the second year, when Queen Magistra's ambassador presented a formal proposal in open council. The proposal was framed as a generous trade arrangement. What it actually was, stripped of its careful language, was a document asking Caelan to sign away 3 of his kingdom's border territories in exchange for financial assistance during his period of recovery. It was offered gently, with great diplomatic courtesy, in front of the entire council and several senior lords. Caelan looked at the document for a long time. He turned it over once, as if making sure he had read it correctly. He looked up at the ambassador with an expression of mild confusion. He said he would need time to study the terms with his advisors. He thanked the ambassador for the long journey. He asked if the man had been given comfortable rooms. The ambassador said yes. The rooms were very comfortable, thank you. Caelan smiled and said he was glad to hear it. That night in the archive, he placed the copy of the proposal on the table next to an authenticated copy, obtained through Seraphine's agent in Magistra's court, of the private agreement between Edric and the Queen, the one that described the financial transfer, the one that promised Edric the throne, the one with both of their marks on it. They are so busy watching the man they think I am that they have forgotten to look for the man I actually am. In the third year, the conspirators set a date. They had decided on the autumn convocation, the formal annual gathering of the full council and all senior lords of the kingdom, held in the Grand Council chamber of the keep. The plan was clean and well considered. Present a formal declaration that the king was no longer capable of ruling, supported by physician reports that had been carefully adjusted to say what was needed. 3 council votes to transfer authority to Edric as regent. The foreign representative from Magistra's court, present to immediately sign the new border agreement. A private guard unit loyal to Edric, quietly positioned at the chamber's exits. From Edric's perspective, it was the final step of a 3-year effort. From Caelan's perspective, it was every person he needed, inside a single room on a date he had known for 6 weeks. He prepared without appearing to prepare. He sent personal notes to 4 lords who had not joined the conspiracy, but whose participation had been cautious and passive. Men who had stopped fully trusting Caelan without ever actively turning against him. The notes were brief. They said only, Attend the convocation, sit near the front, and watch what happens. No explanation, no promise. Just a request, written in the king's own hand, in the firm and clean script that, if any of those lords had thought about it, looked nothing like the uncertain, trailing letters that had appeared in the king's official documents for the past 2 years. On the morning of the convocation, Caelan dressed in his usual understated clothes. He walked to the Grand Council chamber at the usual unhurried pace. He took his seat at the head of the long table and looked, to everyone present, like a man who had wandered into the room through habit and was not entirely sure why everyone else seemed so alert. The session opened with routine business, trade reports, border patrol updates, a minor land dispute from the eastern provinces. Caelan nodded along. Edric sat to his right, perfectly composed, his hands folded on the table, his timing as he had rehearsed it. After the first hour, Edric rose. He spoke with great care. He said it was not easy to raise such a matter. He said that his love for his brother and for the kingdom made silence impossible. He presented the physician's reports. He read several passages aloud in a voice that managed to sound both sorrowful and reasonable. 2 council lords added their agreement immediately. The room tightened. Lords who were not part of the plan looked at one another, uncertain, trying to read which way the weight was falling. Then Lord Chancellor Brath stood up. He did not vote. Instead, he asked a question. He said, carefully, quietly, in the voice of a man choosing his words with great attention, that before the council took an action of such significance, perhaps it would be wise to ensure all existing agreements and obligations were reviewed. He said a change in ruling authority might have legal effects on current treaties that the council had not yet considered. It was a small hesitation, a single question, but it created a pause, and into that pause, Caelan spoke. His voice was clear, it was steady. It carried to every corner of the chamber without being raised, the way a voice does when it has always had that quality, and never actually lost it. He said that the Chancellor made an excellent point. He said perhaps all agreements should be reviewed, including those not yet entered into the official record. He said this while looking at no one in particular, which meant he was looking at everyone. The room went very still. Edric's expression changed. It was a small change, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible pause in his breathing. But Caelan had been watching his half-brother's face for 30 years, and he saw it. Seraphine entered the chamber through the side door. She had no official role in the council. She was the widow of a former spymaster, and in the eyes of the court, she was a woman who was tolerated more out of politeness than purpose. She walked to the council secretary's table and placed a document case in front of him without a word. Inside the case were copies of everything, every financial transfer, every letter, the private agreement between Edric and Queen Magistra, with both their marks clearly visible. 3 separate testimonies that directly contradicted the statements in the adjusted physician's reports. The originals were secured in the archive below the library, with 2 independent witnesses who had been placed there 2 weeks prior. The chain of evidence was complete, authenticated, and unbroken. Edric started to speak. Caelan raised one hand. He said, quietly, "Read those first." The silence that followed lasted a long time, long enough for the council secretary to open the case, long enough for the lord sitting nearest him to lean over and read the first page, long enough for the expression on that lord's face to change. At a signal that no one else in the room recognized, a slight turn of Caelan's right hand, the kind of gesture a person makes when adjusting a ring, the guard units under the loyal commander's authority sealed the chamber's 3 exits. It was done quietly. No drawn weapons, no shouting. Simply large, calm men standing in doorways. The foreign representative rose and mentioned diplomatic protections. He was informed, politely and precisely, that the treaty affording those protections contained a clause, original to the agreement, never removed, rarely remembered, that voided them in cases of direct interference in the internal governance of the host kingdom. A copy of that clause was produced. It had been flagged with a small paper tab. Brath sat down slowly and asked what his options were. He was told, in private, that he could speak fully and honestly, or he could face the same accounting as the others. He chose to speak. He spoke for 4 hours. He was thorough and accurate and frightened, and the record of his testimony filled a thick volume that the council secretary's hand ached for a week afterward. The trials that followed were conducted properly, without theater. Edric was tried before a panel of senior lords, who were not members of his faction. The evidence was presented without embellishment, because it needed none. He was found to have committed deliberate acts against the crown, and stripped of his title, his lands, and his standing within the royal house. He was not imprisoned. He was sent north, to a small and cold estate, where the winters came early and stayed late, and important people did not visit. Magistra's kingdom faced a different kind of consequence. 3 neighboring states, informed of the documented arrangement she had made with a pretender against a sitting monarch, withdrew from trade agreements with her crown. She was not removed from power. She was too careful and too experienced to allow that. But she was diminished, and she understood that Caelan held the original documents and could release them at any moment he chose. It was an invisible chain, and she wore it for the rest of her reign. The council was rebuilt. The positions emptied by the conspiracy were filled by regional representatives chosen for their record and their accountability rather than their family name. The military reviews resumed. General Severus attended the first one, and halfway through his briefing, stopped speaking and looked at the king directly, for the first time in 2 years. Caelan met his eyes and gave a single, small nod. The old general looked down at his papers, cleared his throat, and continued. When Caelan addressed his kingdom, he kept it simple. He said that patience was not weakness. He said that endurance, when it is chosen deliberately, is one of the most powerful decisions a person can make. He said that people who believe they understand a situation based on what they can see on the surface are always surprised when the deeper truth is revealed, and that the best protection a kingdom has is not always an army. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to wait until your enemies have fully committed to a mistake. He did not call it clever. He did not claim it had been easy. He thanked, in general terms, the people who had served in silence, because he understood that keeping a secret for 3 years, while watching someone you respect appear to diminish, is its own form of courage. He did not name Seraphine in the public address. That evening, in the archive room below the library, the last candle burning low between them, he told her that everything that had been saved was equally hers. She looked at the stacks of documents and files and maps that lined the shelves, and said she preferred things the way they were. He said he knew. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, the way people do when they have carried something heavy together for a very long time and are only now allowing themselves to set it down. They studied a man who did not exist, and by the time they understood who they were truly dealing with, the door was already locked behind them. The kingdom moved forward. The seasons turned. The markets in the capital grew busy again. Children who had been small during those 3 quiet years grew old enough to hear the story, and the story they heard was not a story of armies or battles. It was a story about a king who had understood something that his enemies never did, that the most dangerous person in any room is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is the one sitting quietly in the corner, watching, waiting, and remembering everything.